Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Full Court Press. I am your host, Drew Duncan. Do not forget that Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram is all at Drew Duncan83. Additionally, you can find me on YouTube. Simply look for Drew Duncan. And of course, you can always find the Full Court Press in our subsidiaries on Facebook and Instagram. That is the Full Court Press, football, basketball, and MMA. Big game, just got done watching it. Obviously, Final Four, Auburn, Virginia. Auburn's first trip to the Final Four. Virginia is going to be taking their first trip to the national championship game now. And before I get going on this, I just want to shout out Charles Barkley. He's allowed to be a fan. It's his alma mater. I know he's disappointed in the outcome. Shout out to Auburn and Virginia, both teams playing phenomenal basketball this evening. There had to be a winner. There had to be a loser. And Virginia's going on. Auburn is going home. You know, when I watched Auburn in the tournament, specifically in the Elite Eight, when I paid very close attention to them, because as I made mention, I completely overlooked Auburn in any of my brackets. Not a huge believer in the SEC in terms of basketball. I really think that there was a glaring weakness that I saw with Auburn throughout this tournament. And the big one came from the Elite Eight game, and then it carried over into today's game. Number one, or what I should say is the glaring weakness, is that out of the timeouts, they always seem to play really well. Whatever Bruce Pearl, their head coach, did to make an adjustment, they always seem to do really well out of a timeout, right? They executed, played solid defense, able to pick up the pace and score a little bit, create some turnovers, start running their type of fast-paced style of basketball game, turning their defense into offense. We saw even Harper a couple of times, coast to coast with some running the floor. But during the course of the game, not coming out of those timeouts, and as the game seemed to progress, that was, to me, the weakness with the Auburn Tigers. They just, whatever was happening, they had a very difficult time making those adjustments prove to be sustainable for them as that segment in the game continued to play out. And we saw that throughout the tournament, big time in the Elite Eight game. And then, of course, we saw that again tonight in the Final Four. I know that the huge topic of discussion is going to be whether or not that was a look. Guy was fouled, okay? It's not the hardest foul in the world. Could it have gone uncalled if they really wanted to? Probably. But it did affect the shot. And that is a point-blank situation. And Guy was huge for Virginia down the stretch, right? He hit that huge three, which kept him in it. I mean, you talk about off balance, man in your face, able to hit the tray. Then, of course, he had the wherewithal when he initially bobbled the basketball, and then he was able to get back across half court. Then he got fouled again, and that actually stopped the clock, giving Virginia a little bit of time to assess what they were going to do offensively. So when you look at Virginia and what they're capable of, the reason why they won that game isn't because they were up by 9 or 10 at one point and Auburn made yet another comeback like what we saw in the Elite Eight. It literally had nothing to do with so much what they built, but whatever experience that team has in the ACC, I think ultimately is what got them. Look, you look at Guy on the free throw line. If you watched the game, you heard the announcers. How do you make those, right? He had 2 in a row at the end of the game. Then they call a timeout. They're basically trying to ice him. And he just, and you could see the confidence. He wasn't worried about it. And the entire team exuded that for Virginia throughout the course of the basketball game. Even when Auburn was making their run towards the latter parts of that basketball game, Virginia seemed unfazed by everything that was going on. And I've said this before, and I'll say it again. It's because in the East Coast, that is where the toughest, physical, and most competitive basketball in this country is being played at the collegiate level. You look at Syracuse, you look at Marquette, you look at Virginia, you look at Virginia Tech, you look at a team that's not on the East Coast, but they're in the ACC, Louisville, up and down, Georgetown. It's just Villanova. I mean, UConn, the names can go on forever, right? And it is the most competitive basketball in this country. And a 5 seed in Auburn hung with what many believe to be the best team in basketball throughout the course of the year. Period. You can't take anything away from Auburn. They played phenomenal. But Virginia proved that it's not necessarily about being a one-dimensional team or being able to perfect, all facets of it. Because you heard the announcers, again, if you watched the game, talked about how Auburn made it this far, right? And they were actually being out-rebounded throughout the course of the tournament, which is something that had never happened before. And you heard me talk about it in a previous segment. One of the ways that I pick my teams is believing who is the better rebounding team and who is the better defensive team. I mean, I stick to the old school mentality. Rebounding helps create offense because, number one, if it's a defensive rebound, you could potentially get a fast break. And then, of course, offensively, you're giving yourself a lot of second chance points. And that's why I overlooked Auburn. But ultimately, that wasn't even their greatest weakness. Their greatest weakness was their inability to perform throughout the course of an entire basketball game. And I think not being able to play the full 40 minutes, doing great out of timeouts, but adjustments being made along by the other team's players and coaches during in-game situations ultimately is what did them in. And again, I'm not taking anything away from Bruce Pearl. Obviously, hell of a coaching job just this year with that basketball team. I love the combination of Harper and Brown. I think both of those guys could have huge futures ahead of them in whatever they choose to pursue next, especially in terms of basketball. So there you have my 2 cents on that. Obviously, I've got another game that I got to go and watch. But in the meantime, Virginia moving on, Auburn going home after a hell of a basketball game. I am Drew Duncan, host of the Full Court Press. Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram is all at Drew Duncan 83. Find me on YouTube, simply Drew Duncan. And of course, when you share my posts, don't forget to use the hashtag Don't You Dare Touch That Dial. And as always, don't you dare touch that dial.